scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sunlight streaming through their window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across the yellow walls. Peppa looked at herself in the mirror and noticed something odd. Her reflection seemed to move just a fraction of a second after she did. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Her usual cheerful humming had a hollow echo to it, and when she turned to greet the children, her eyes appeared darker than normal. George bounced down the stairs, clutching his favorite dinosaur toy, but the plastic eyes of the dinosaur seemed to follow every movement in the room. Outside, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as always, yet something felt fundamentally different. The houses had the same bright colors, but their windows looked like empty eye sockets staring back at them. When Susie Sheep arrived to play, her movements seemed slightly jerky, and her laughter echoed in ways that made the air feel thick and uncomfortable. More friends gathered: Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, and Candy Cat. Pedro's eyes never seemed to blink. Rebecca's ears twitched at sounds no one else could hear, and Candy Cat purred continuously, even when she wasn't speaking. The children decided to play hide-and-seek inside Peppa's house, but the hallways seemed longer than they remembered. Peppa began counting, her voice creating multiple echoes that seemed to come from different directions. 1, 2, 3. Each number hung in the air longer than it should have. The counting continued, but now there were voices counting along with her. Voices that sounded exactly like hers but came from somewhere else entirely. As evening approached, the family gathered in their living room. The familiar green walls and purple furniture looked the same, but shadows gathered in corners where there had never been shadows before. When they spoke, their voices seemed to come from slightly behind them, as if someone else was speaking their words just a moment after they thought them. That night, as Peppa and George lay in their beds, they could hear George's rhythmic breathing. But when Peppa looked over at her brother, she saw that his eyes were glowing softly in the darkness, and his breathing continued, even though his mouth wasn't moving. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to sleep, but she could feel that something fundamental had changed in their world. Everything looked the same, everyone acted the same, but nothing was quite right anymore. The colors were the same bright yellows and pinks, the voices were the same cheerful tones, but underneath it all was the growing realization that this might not be their real home at all. Peppa wondered if this strange, slightly wrong version of her life was now permanent, or if somewhere out there, the real world was still waiting for them to find their way back. As she drifted off to sleep, she wondered what tomorrow would bring in this place that looked like home but felt like something else entirely.
Peppa Pig, the wrong family. Peppa woke up one morning, just like always. The sun was shining through the curtains, birds chirped outside, and George was softly snoring next to her. Everything seemed normal. She stretched, hopped out of bed, and walked to the kitchen. Mummy Pig was frying pancakes. Daddy Pig sat at the table with a newspaper. George was already eating. Everything was just as usual. "Good morning," Peppa said cheerfully. Mummy Pig turned to her. "Good morning, Peppa," she replied, but her voice wasn't right. Too low, flat, without tone. Daddy Pig lowered his newspaper. "We're having a wonderful morning," he said. His voice was strange, too, similar but somehow delayed, dry, like a radio announcer. "George?" Peppa sat next to him. "Are you okay?" He smiled, wide, too wide, and said, "Good morning, Peppa," like a line he had memorized, like it wasn't really him. Peppa gave a nervous laugh. "You're joking, right?" But no one laughed. Mummy kept flipping pancakes, not blinking. Daddy turned another page, still not blinking. George just stared at her. "Why aren't you blinking?" Peppa whispered. "We blink when you're not looking," Mummy said, in that same unfamiliar voice. Peppa jumped up and ran out of the kitchen. Her heart was pounding. She ran to the hallway mirror and froze. Behind her, in the reflection, stood Mummy, Daddy, and George. But their faces were off, slightly warped as if drawn too quickly. The smiles didn't fade, and their eyes were completely black. She spun around, and no one was there. When Peppa returned to the bedroom, George was sitting on the bed, softly repeating, "Good morning, Peppa. Good morning, Peppa." Again and again. "Who are you?" she whispered. "What did you do to my family?" Daddy Pig stood in the doorway. "We are your family," he said. "We always have been." Mummy Pig stepped up behind her. "Just don't ask questions." The next morning, Peppa woke up before George. She checked his face, quietly held up a mirror. In the reflection, his eyes were missing. Just black voids. Since then, she pretends everything is fine. She eats breakfast, plays, answers questions. But at night, she hears something in the kitchen speaking in her voice, repeating, "Good morning, Peppa," even if it's still the middle of the night.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up to find their house completely silent. No sounds of Mummy Pig making breakfast, no humming from Daddy Pig. The children called out, but only echoes answered from the empty rooms. As they walked through the house, they noticed something strange. All the family photos on the walls showed only empty frames, as if their parents had vanished from the pictures themselves. The kitchen was set for breakfast, but the food was cold and untouched. George pointed to the window. Outside, their neighbors were standing in their gardens, perfectly still like statues. Mrs. Rabbit, Mr. Bull, even Susie Sheep's family, all frozen with their backs turned to Peppa's house. The children went outside to investigate. The moment they stepped through the front door, they felt a strange chill. The whole neighborhood was eerily quiet. No birds singing, no sounds of life anywhere. As they walked down the street, every house looked exactly the same as theirs, windows dark, doors slightly ajar. Peppa called out to their friends, but her voice seemed to disappear into the air. At the end of the street stood a figure that looked exactly like Daddy Pig, but something was wrong. He was facing away from them, standing perfectly still, swaying slightly as if he were hollow inside. Peppa approached cautiously, calling "Daddy," but when the figure slowly turned around, they saw that while it had Daddy Pig's glasses and clothes, its face was completely blank, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth pink skin. More figures began appearing from behind houses and trees, Mummy Pig, Grandpa Pig, Granny Pig, all walking slowly toward Peppa and George with that same blank, featureless face. Their movements were stiff and unnatural. Peppa grabbed George's hand and they ran back toward their house, but the blank figures were following them. The children could hear a strange humming sound growing louder, coming from all the faceless figures at once. They reached their front door and slammed it shut, breathing heavily. But when they turned around, they realized they were no longer in their familiar home. Everything felt wrong, as if they were looking at a perfect copy. George started crying and Peppa tried to comfort him, but then she noticed something terrifying. In the mirror hanging in their hallway, she could see their reflection clearly, but behind them stood all the blank figures. The humming sound was getting closer, coming from inside the house now. The figures in the mirror were moving, reaching out toward their reflections. She grabbed George and they ran upstairs to their bedroom. In their bedroom, they hid under the covers. But the humming was now so loud, it seemed to come from inside their heads. When Peppa finally gathered courage to peek out, she saw that in the mirror, George's reflection had no face. She looked at her own reflection and watched in horror as her features slowly began to fade away, starting with her smile, then her eyes, until she too became one of the blank figures. The humming stopped, and everything became silent.
Peppa Pig, the guest with no mouth. It was a normal evening. Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper, Mummy Pig was knitting, and George was playing with his dinosaur. But when Peppa walked into the living room, he was already there. Sitting on the sofa, between Daddy and the armchair, was a guest, a stranger, very tall, with a smooth, bald head and very large, round eyes. He didn't speak, didn't move, he just stared. "Who's that?" Peppa whispered. "Oh, Peppa," Mummy smiled. "That's our guest. He's been here since morning." "I don't remember him." "You probably just didn't notice," Daddy Pig replied. "He's very quiet." The guest didn't say a word. He just watched. His eyes were open far too wide, as if he couldn't blink. His face, smooth, with no mouth, no wrinkles, only emptiness and silence. Peppa sat next to George, but she couldn't stop watching the guest. Something was wrong. He didn't breathe. He didn't twitch. But every time she looked away, he seemed a little closer. At first, he was sitting in the corner, then in the nearby chair, then at the edge of the sofa. "George, do you see that?" she whispered. "He was farther away," George said. "Is he moving?" But as soon as they looked directly at him, he froze again, as if he'd always been sitting right there. "He never blinks," Peppa added. "Never." Before bed, she asked Mummy, "Will he still be here tonight?" "Of course," Mummy said calmly. "He's our guest." Peppa got into bed, trying not to think about him. But when the house fell quiet, she heard a soft creak and footsteps. She sat up. The door to their room was open. A faint light from the hallway spilled in, and in it, his silhouette. Tall, still, he was standing in the doorway, watching. Peppa held her breath. He didn't move, but when she blinked, he was closer and closer. "George, wake up." But George was asleep. When Peppa looked at the door again, he was gone. She slowly turned her head. He was standing by the bed, but now his face had changed. Where there was once nothing, now there was a slit, slowly opening, and inside, no teeth, just darkness, endless, pulling darkness. He didn't move, didn't speak, but the darkness inside him seemed to shift on its own. Peppa shut her eyes tight, pressed herself close to George, and then everything went silent. In the morning, the guest was gone. Mummy and Daddy said nothing, only smiled. "Did you sleep well, Peppa?" Daddy Pig asked. She nodded without looking at the sofa, because she knew he was still there, just sitting and waiting for someone to look away. A lost Peppa Pig episode that never aired on TV. Night fell upon Peppa Pig's house, bringing with it an unaccustomed silence. Even the crickets outside were quiet. Peppa lay on her top bunk, trying to fall asleep, but something unsettled her. George, below, snored peacefully, but Peppa felt she wasn't alone in the stillness. Suddenly, from the depths of the house, a faint, drawn-out creak echoed. It sounded like an old, ungreased door, but it seemed to emanate from the very walls. The creak repeated, a little louder this time, and Peppa felt a shiver run down her spine. She cautiously peeked out from under her covers. The room was shrouded in gloom, and the shadows cast by the furniture seemed alive. The creak became rhythmic, as if someone was slowly and heavily walking across the wooden floor. The footsteps drew closer, and Peppa realized they were coming from the hallway directly towards their room. She held her breath, listening to every sound. The door to their room was slightly ajar, and a faint light from the hallway seeped through the crack. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Then another creak sounded, but this time it was very close, as if someone was slowly opening the door. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut, afraid of what might enter. She heard a soft rustle, like the whisper of old fabric, and felt the air in the room grow heavy and cold. Opening her eyes, she saw a thin, writhing shadow slowly creeping into the room through the crack in the door. The shadow resembled a long, twisting ribbon, slowly slithering across the floor, approaching George's bed. The shadow reached George's bed and began to slowly ascend it. Peppa couldn't move, her body seemingly paralyzed by fear. She watched as the shadow enveloped the sleeping George, and from within it came a faint, barely discernible whisper, like the rustle of dry leaves. The whisper grew louder, and Peppa felt her eyelids grow heavy. The last thing she saw were two dull, glowing points in the center of the shadow, staring directly at her. Then darkness consumed her. In the morning, Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig entered the room. Peppa was asleep in her bunk, but George was not in his bed below. His blanket was neatly folded and his favorite dinosaur toy lay on his pillow. The parents searched the entire house, but George was nowhere to be found. And sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, if you listen closely, you might hear a faint, drawn-out creak echoing from the depths of the house, and a soft, barely discernible whisper that seems to call out a name.